This is the Black Belt armor set and one of the Defender class weapons that arrived with it. To some, it's as good as cheating. To others, they say it will make you bad at the game. Its design intent is to let players burst through the early game to get to high rank and then end game as quickly as possible, because we're on a ticking clock now, and there's a big fat expansion coming by the name of Sunbreak that you'll need to be at end game stage in base rise to even access the content it's providing, and maybe you're new, or maybe you've switched platforms. In this video, I put this armor and weapon pairing to a real-world test and a full playthrough to find out if indeed it is overpowered enough to be considered cheating. Simple rules: brand new file, use nothing but the Black Belt set and the Defender weapon. In this case, I've chosen Switch Axe, but every weapon type has a Defender option. And the intent is to see how practical it is, how hard it is, and how fast it is just taking the critical path only, that is, only the key quest necessary to actually progress through the early game and unlock the increasing difficulty ranks. And see just how long it takes me to bust through the single-player village quests to reach a point in the game where joining other players in multiplayer hub quests is practical, and how over or underpowered I feel when I get there. Hello again, I am Blunty. At what point does this allegedly overpowered catch-up set start to reach tipping point of balance? When is it time to start thinking about crafting up some custom gear? How far can this set carry you? And how much of the content can it just kind of tank you through? Let's find out together. I won't be taking any shortcuts, I won't be using any speedrunning methodology or other exploitative techniques. I'll just be playing normally, at a comfortable pace, doing only the quests that are necessary to progress, and I won't be farming at all. So in the time since launch, the devs have also distributed several packs of various consumable items to players, so we'll be using those too. They're freebies, why not? And this not only stacks us with big fat stacks of cash that we can use to buy some consumables with, once we sell off a small pile of golden eggs we'll get given, but also comes with a fair pile of basic things like health potions, even the upgraded version. Now, like I opened with, to some of the existing player base in Monster Hunter, armor and weapons like this, I guess controversial is the right word. The word cheating gets tossed around as well, rather lazily by people who don't know what words mean. And it's an attitude mostly born out of the belief that the similarly intended Defender armor and weapon set introduced in Monster Hunter World before its own expansion, Iceborne, was released, is considered way overpowered. So overpowered that people using it supposedly end up baking in some pretty bad gameplay habits, missing out on some of the important learning opportunities, and by the time they were ready to move on to normal crafted armor and weapons, the strength of the Defender gear was such that supposedly these players never developed the kinds of technique and skill required to move forward in the game, and thus were an anchor of death and a parasite in the end game multiplayer content. Don't know how much of that is fair to say, but it is fair to say there is some truth to it at least. World's Defender armor is indeed quite powerful, and the weapons possibly even more unbalanced for early game. They indeed trivialize the early game to nearly comedic levels, frankly. And if you believe the anecdotes of already established players around that time, it led to a flood of new players with terrible skill, poor knowledge, and bad habits. And again, I don't know how much truth there is to that, but you know how gamers are, so probably not a lot. So when two new sets of armor including familiar sounding Defender weapon collections were added to Rise, some of the fandom reacted with trepidation. Back in October, when the first of the armor sets were released, we saw a whole wave of this panic, and indeed I made a video back in October about that one too, utterly debunking the worries that it was going to be overpowered, because this set, the Guild Cross set, was specifically designed for gathering materials, not for making you an unstoppable tank. It was intended to reduce some of the grind for material farming and the crafting. I didn't do a full early game playthrough with that one, but I did test it against a few representative monsters going up the difficulty ranks, and it wasn't all that powerful, and it was quickly outclassed by basic crafted armor and weapons. More recently though, the second set arrived, the one we're talking about today, the Black Belt set. This set was much more powerful and significantly higher base defense, had set bonuses of significant elemental resistances and boost to attack power and stamina, and even raw protection with the earplugs skill. Unlike the Guild Cross set, this set was indeed intended to trivialize the early game hunts and let new players just bust past it quickly, instead of doing it the originally intended way of gradually increasing your gear quality and learning about crafting and upgrading and armor skills. And as you've been seeing while I set all this up, it is indeed quite powerful early game. Now, I've played through the early game in full 3 times. Once when the game launched, obviously, once more just before PC launch, as I was testing some things on a new character on my Switch to see which direction I wanted to go on my PC playthrough, and naturally, once more, when the PC version released. So I'm pretty familiar with how things feel early game, or how they're supposed to feel, I suppose, when you're crafting gear as you go through. The black belt armor and defender weapon absolutely feel different, much stronger. I was basically brain off mode for the first 6 of the 23 hunts I did in this run, partly because of the trivial damage the monsters could do to me, partly because of the base power of the weapon, and of course partly because, well, I knew these fights already. Hunt 7 with Barroth was the first time I had a small problem that made me pay attention even a little bit, which of course is being that this is the first monster with a body part hard enough to deflect green sharpness weapons. Ting! And that's why he's here. He's here to teach you that lesson about weak points and strong points, about weapon bouncing, and that lesson still gets taught just fine with this gear. Although, a couple of the monsters just before Barroth are also learning points about elemental blights like fire and water. That lesson doesn't get taught as effectively because the elemental resistance of this armor just made that kind of a non-issue. I mean, you can still get set on fire, but it doesn't do nearly the amount of damage it's intended to. Stuff smooths out again for the next several hunts as things settle in, a few faster monsters, some like Kululaku, who have conditional defensive and offensive stances. They remain the teaching points they're intended to be, even if the fight is easier than it normally would be because of, well, lower risk of failure, frankly. The first potential wall for new players is probably most likely Old Rathian here, a mix of ground and airborne mobility, poison and fire, and wide-reaching sweeping attacks will put newly learned skills to the test, and new players through a bit of a gauntlet. Also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is the first monster with a severable tail as well. In true Monster Hunter fashion, the game doesn't tell you this, it just waits for you to learn it. In any case, the hunt goes smoothly too. Again, the mix of elemental and physical resistances on the armor make it a much more forgiving experience if you get sloppy. Next up comes Beserios, expanding on what the likes of Kululaku have taught you about conditional vulnerabilities, and here it's where we see the basic sharpness of the defender weapon become more of an issue. To be clear, the same is true of any weapon at this stage of the game, but the defender gear at least has significantly more green sharpness gauge than most other level appropriate weapons will have at this point, so it's still pretty forgiving. Now Barroth, old Big Tooth Barry. Here is where I suspected I might start having some issues. To be frank, he is not my strongest matchup under any circumstance, never has been. Tends to bat me around like a cat toy, especially when I'm playing Switch Axe, because I tend to overcommit to my gloriously satisfying combos, and I get locked into my animations way too often for this Zerpy boy and his extreme pouncy mobility. I should probably do something about those bad habits before Sunbreak arrives. But I actually did just fine in this fight. 5.5 minutes, in fact. Again, with the high defense on the armor, it let me sort of tank some hits that would otherwise be something of a pucker moment in normal gear at this stage. The next pair of hunts were similarly issue-free, nothing of any interest to report really. Vulvadon is meant to teach you about staying out of trouble as his paralyzing tongue lash locks you down and his gross fart cloud locks you out of healing. But he's not actually all that tough to fight once you get a handle on these two mechanics. Annoying, sure, as he bounces around the place, but not actually that hard. Toby Kadachi is another potential wall for newbies with very high speed and a much smaller hitbox than Big Tooth Barry, also paired with projectiles this time. But again, the black belt gear makes this a more forgiving learning experience than it otherwise would be. Now, according to speedrun.com, a record time to get from brand new character to the Magnamalo quest Comeuppance is 1 hour and 14 minutes, stretching out to about 3 hours as you go down the leaderboard. With the black belt and defender pairing, it took me about 4.5 hours to get to busting up Maggie here without even trying to go fast, without any strategies at all. Anyway, this wasn't my smoothest fight with low-rank Maggie ever, and I certainly took a few more hits than I needed to, and some of that was a little deliberate tanking for testing out where my defense was sitting at. And by the end of the fight, I needed to use 7 of my 10 mega potions. So yeah, Maggie was doing a fair amount of damage. And with a sub 10 minute clear time, it's here that I feel we're just on the edge of balance for this gear. The defense is still pretty high, and the weapon damage is just about where it should be at this point. And it's here where we get a false credits roll. It's not actually the end of the game, it's not even the end of the village content, but it's more like just the end of the first chapter, where the villagers think the big threat has been dealt with. But there is still a few more key quests to do before the village stuff is actually fully unlocked. The oldest flagship monster in the entire series comes out next, and Rathalos feels about right with this set too. The damage output from a weapon no longer feels overpowered, the sharpness management is becoming more of a bother, something I have to pay attention to a little more often, and my physical and elemental defenses are on the edge of lagging behind, because it is a generally low-level overall defense to all elements and not something specific. But again, this fight is familiar, so a clear time of just over 7 minutes is pretty decent. And it's a very similar story for Angenette too, except without the acrobatics of Rathalos, it's a bit easier to deal with using a weapon as grounded as the Swax is, or at least grounded until you unlock the diving Silkbind attack. And sure enough, we get a sub 7 minute hunt here too. Now, Xenoga is where I consider the tipping point is. My clear time here was about the same as Angenette, but I was feeling the pressure a lot more intently, which is the whole point of Xenoga, really. So all that felt pretty much right. And from the perspective of a new player just trying to learn this fight, I've no doubt they'll feel this is as challenging in the black belt armor as they would be in crafted armor at this point in the game. Mitzi was a bit of an issue. Bubble Boy is fast and zerpy, but is also a bit of a glass cannon. Quite easy to knock down, and with the exhaust element on the Defender Switch Axe, few other monsters so far have been as vulnerable to it. Sub 6 minute clear time. Mud Bitch next, one of my least favourite fights in the whole game. Illumidrone is just annoying to fight. Not hard, just annoying. A bit like Vulvadon. There's no big challenge here, it's just really, really annoying. In any case, I used 3 potions in total, and it was an 8 minute clear time, so that feels probably about right. Now, I carted exactly once in this entire run, and it happened as we got to Gos Harag. And to be fair, the cart was mostly because I love this fight so much. In stark contrast to Illumidrone, I love this fight. It is one of my very favourite fights in the entire game, in fact, and I was probably having a little bit too much fun. I got a bit cocky with it and overcommitted a few times and got my ass wheeled back to camp. Overall, though, it wasn't especially hard, again, mostly owing to the fact that I know the hunt well enough, and the hunt time came in comfortably under 10 minutes still. And finally for this run, Diablos. And here, that feeling of being at the tipping point for the practicality of the armor and weapons starts to solidify. I didn't cart, but I did burn through half of my mega potions over the 8 minute 52 second hunt, and I certainly felt like I had to stay on my toes, as you should be in a Diablos fight. And with this hunt, we have completed the remainder of the village key quest requirements. It was a pretty smooth experience all up. And there is no armor upgrade at all as we go through here. What we start with is what we finish with. But about 2/3 in, there is a small 1-stage upgrade for the weapon for slightly increased base damage and a little bit of sharpness. Nothing dramatic, but we absolutely needed it for the sharpness management alone. There's a few more non-essential village hunts to have a go at this point, but it's also now when a natural transition over to the hub quests, and multiplayer hunting is the natural next step. And while the lowest tier stuff here in hub is still very, very doable with the black belt armor, a lot of it being just the same hunts as village, just with difficulty ticked up slightly and the monsters having high HP pools, by now you've probably got materials enough to start to craft better stuff anyway. Say, for example, a full set of low-rank Illumidrone gear for some Switch Axe specific skills. You'll lose a bit of attack boost and you'll trade off some elemental resistances, but your base defense jumps right up and your gameplay will feel a lot better thanks to things like Razor Sharp and Speed Sharpening, making the weapon management a lot better, Evade Extender giving you a huge boost in mobility, and of course Rapid Morph, an essential skill for Switch Axe, which will, amongst other things, boost your DPS and your combo flexibility in a very significant way. Plus you get lower ranks of Weakness Exploit, Power Prolonger, and Evade Window coming along for the ride, all of which are very, very useful with this particular weapon. The Defender weapon itself will last you a little bit longer still. Its upgraded 150 base attack matches the best available from the other weapon trees at this point, and the exhaust files are a personal favourite of mine. But this is as powerful as this weapon will ever get. You won't get much deeper into hub questing before some more powerful options start opening up for you. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Black Belt armor and the Defender weapon sets are indeed pretty perfectly balanced to take players comfortably through the single player village quest and plop them in the hub quest where it will start degrading in practicality, and will do so without carrying them too far deep here or limiting their ability to learn how things are done properly in regards to skill ceilings and proper armor and weapon crafting, building mixed sets and skill matchups. and all of which, even without the black belt armor, is pretty easy to just kind of ignore in the village quests because, well, frankly, they are quite easy. So no, I don't consider this gear cheating, and no, I don't think it will make for a batch of new players who don't know how to play properly. In fact, I think it is very, very carefully balanced. It just does what it's meant to do. It speeds up burning through the lowest level single player stuff to get you into the meat of the experience faster and smoother. I think the dev team have done a much better job with this armor than they did with the Defender armor and weapon sets in Monster Hunter World, which are not as bad as most people make them out to be, but were still a little bit overbalanced in my opinion. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you found this interesting. I am Blunty. Thanks as always to the Patreon scrolling up above there, and I'll see you in Sunbreak.